Approximately 251.9 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, life on Earth was struggling, and that's putting it very lightly, as the Permian Triassic extinction event was raging on. And for the uninitiated, this event, commonly known as the Great Dying, was the worst extinction our planet has ever endured, and it made the dinosaurs' doomsday look like a warm hug. And a bit different to the dinosaurs' ending as well, this calamity came not from a space rock, but rather from a thing that still surrounds us, even today: volcanoes. But you can't heave a small sigh of relief, since Permian volcanoes were quite a different breed than those currently, and massive eruptions stemming from the Siberian traps are believed to have ushered in a wide range of unpleasantries that led to the Great Dying. And unsurprisingly, this included brutal heat, aridity, lava flows, and widespread fires, just to name a few. And these conditions would last for thousands upon thousands of years, snuffing out the vast majority of life. And when the dust finally settled, shockingly little remained, with some studies finding that 96% of all marine species died out, and that in total, 9 out of every 10 animals perished. It was so severe that even the little could-be nuclear survivors, known as insects, suffered greatly too, which is an important fact, as typically mass extinctions don't usually touch these guys. But the Permian one was just that much of a beast. It would ultimately take the Earth some 50 million years to fully recover, which for comparison, the entire Ice Age hasn't even been going on for that long in totality. So bottom line, it sucked. A lot. And yet, we only tend to focus on how it was right before the extinction, or during it. Rarely does anyone pay attention to what the planet was like immediately afterwards. And this is unfortunate, as it's pretty interesting, in a kind of grim way. As newsflash, things don't get settling better when you lose over 90% of everything. Which thus begs the question of what was it like? To the best of our knowledge, this event ended right at the Triassic-Permian boundary, hence the boundary, and was marked by the beginning of the Induan, the early Triassic's first epoch. This period of time played out between 251.9 and 249.9 million years ago, representing the first 2 million years following the Great Dying. And boy oh boy, were they some rough ones, being harsh enough that it makes you question if the immediate survivors were really the truly lucky ones. And if I somehow teleported you to the Induan right now, your first thought would not be to check out what the survivors are like, as you'd immediately start screaming in pain. And why, you ask? Simple, because of the weather and climate, which remained atrocious following the Permian, and was arguably at an all-time low, figuratively speaking, as literally the temperature was insane, with blistering heats being the norm across the planet. In fact, one study reported that the average sea surface temperature in the equatorial oceans possibly would have exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, the same temperature that health organizations say to never surpass in a hot tub. Yeah, a freaking hot tub. In our land, it was even worse, with some days possibly breaking 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius, which is basically hot enough to cook pork, fish, beef, or in this case, you. And you could expect burns, dehydration, and a heat stroke, all to occur very, very quickly. I mean, you can essentially think of the land as a giant oven, with some strong emphasis on the giant part, as back then, the supercontinent of Pangaea was at the peak of its size, with it then being composed of all major landmasses. It also didn't help much that much of Pangaea was arid. The heat, plus the well-placed central Pendean mountains, transformed much of the continent's interior into expansive superdeserts, in which life was near absent, and dunes would have gone on for thousands of miles or kilometers, perhaps even putting Arrakis to shame. And so, if you were teleported there, good luck getting out of that. And even if you could figure out the whole heat situation, there were still other Induan hurdles to overcome, a big one being the air, or rather, lack thereof. You see, we humans can really only enjoy Earth's air thanks to the delicate balance of oxygen in the atmosphere, which stands at approximately 21% currently. And that might not seem very high, but it gets the job done, and just slight changes can be catastrophic, which in this case wasn't even slight, with the number being completely out of whack following the Permian extinction, with levels being as low as 12%. And this number is what we would consider deficient by human standards, and breathing this toxic air would have caused the following effects: a rapid pulse, fast breathing, GI issues, headaches, poor sleep, fatigue, and if you stick around long enough, high-altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema, wherein fluid would fill up your lungs and brain, which I can assure you would not be pleasant. Oh, and before I forget, not only did you have little oxygen, aridity, and heat to look forward to, you also had hypercanes. No, not hurricanes, hypercanes. These were essentially hurricanes on steroids, which we have never ever seen, but hypothetically form once sea temperatures reach a certain threshold, specifically 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. When this happens, you then get the apocalyptic hypercanes that are likely capable of achieving wind speeds as fast as 970 kilometers or 600 miles per hour, which is not only fast enough to easily flatten and reinforce concrete structures, but is also faster than any tornado ever recorded, period. And, about devil at that. Then to make matters worse, just staying away from the coast wouldn't have kept you out of danger, which historically is the case with hurricanes, as hypercanes at ridiculously low central pressures, meaning that these megastorms could 1. Have immense lifespans, possibly lasting for several weeks, and 2. Be absolutely massive in size, with the biggest systems possibly being as large as continental America. Yeah, so in other words, no matter where you are, brace yourselves. And if these things are going to be any more scary, it turns out that they were so intense they literally damaged the ozone layer. And simply standing in one, if you were able to somehow ignore the whole review part winds, would essentially make it so you can't breathe and give you altitude sickness due to the ridiculously low pressure core. And so at this point, you may be confused on how anything could even survive these times. And for the most part, they couldn't, with many areas being near or entirely void of meaningful life. Yet truthfully, not all of Antair was this extreme, with the more northern and southern latitudes providing refuge for animals and plants, as they could be a mix of warmer, but not burn your face off, to more temperate biomes. And then areas close to the poles could even get a bit cold. But not in the way you might imagine cold, as during this whole epoch, it would have been too hot for ice to permanently form, including at the poles themselves. Sorry, Santa Claus. And in these areas, away from the center, early Triassic's fauna and flora were finally allowed a breather. For the trees, it was conifers and lycopods in particular that were doing quite well, and vast forests composed of them would have stretched out across certain regions, while in other areas they were present, but a bit more sparse in abundance. Meanwhile, studies on various formations also suggest that numerous waterways cut through many environments, providing some much welcome fresh water and resources for the animals and plants that live within. And if I could somehow drop you into one of these more sane areas, I can almost guarantee what animal you would see first, as it was without a doubt the king of Pangaea, and by a huge margin at that, being the most successful animal of the entire Earth Triassic, and a contender for the most successful animal ever, period. And its name, the Lystrosaurus. Now granted, when you get a good look at this guy, you might be left feeling a bit underwhelmed, and perhaps even confused as to how a creature like this becomes king. But don't be sleeping on the Lystrosaurus, as it was full on metal. I mean, it literally survived the worst extinction event of all time with flying colors, and its survival alone has made it a fan favorite amongst paleontologists, who have always been highly interested in just how the heck did this guy beat great dying. After all, the Lystrosaurus doesn't exactly look all that remarkably tough on the outside, no offense, with the genus bearing a superficial resemblance to pigs. And they generally weren't the largest either, with most species being about the size of a small dog, while the biggest still fell under 10 feet or 3 meters long, tail included. And in addition to not being giant, it wasn't like Lystrosaurus as some voracious killing machine or armored tank, rather just an innocent herbivorous theropod, whose most unique trait was arguably just its 2 sole teeth, which came in the form of tusk-like canines. So just how did it survive then? Well, there's a few ideas. One of the more straightforward ones is that it simply locked out. But with that said, there are some things about it that do suggest that there was some skill diff at play too, with a prominent idea suggesting its crack digging skills were key. You see, Lystrosaurus's tusks might have actually operated like biological shovels. And to go along with this, each species came equipped with robust hind limbs and then proportionally even more chiseled forelimbs, signs that it dug. And why? To nest in burrows. This would have been a huge advantage, as the area during this time became hazardous and toxic, not to mention that also helped keep them sheltered from the intense heat and UV radiation. Additionally, these guys were seemingly S-tier breathers as well, possessing barrel chests that could house large lungs, short internal nostrils that allowed for rapid breathing, and finally, high narrow spines that empowered the muscles responsible for breathing and contracting its chest, and thus transforming it into a pure oxygen gobbler, an important trait during the Great Dying, with, the 12% oxygen levels and stuff. However, despite this hypothesis being popular, there are other ideas out there, with another trendy proposal having to do with a hypothesis based on the growth marks of a specimen coming out of Antarctica. To be exact, certain features seen on the tusk of one individual hinted that Lystrosaurus could potentially enter states of prolonged torpor, which is a lot like hibernation, helping them to kind of just sleep out the worst of the Permian extinction. So basically, Lystrosaurus might have survived by essentially napping through catastrophe, which honestly makes me kind of jealous that I can't just hibernate on command. But some things can't help out with sleep, which is why I'm excited to introduce today's sponsor, AG1, which helps us do just that, especially with their new product, AGC. Simply put, AGC is a nightly drink that can help you something often slept on: sleep. Get it? In today's day and age, I probably don't need to remind you what it feels like to have a bad night's rest. And as someone who struggled with insomnia, I've come to almost fear both getting into bed and then when the time arrives to get out of it. Which is why I'm grateful I don't live in the Neolithic and actually have some options to help me get a good rest. and this includes AGZ. It's a delicious drink that is chock full of a bunch of helpful ingredients that help you unwind and relax, consisting of various herbs, minerals, vitamins, antioxidants, and more. And something that I personally like is that it doesn't have a bunch of sugar, dairy, gluten, artificial sweeteners, and maltone, which maybe feel a bit off. You've also got a ton of flavors like chocolate, chocolate mint, and mixed berry, with my personal favorite having to be the chocolate. And it goes great with water, or milk, or oat milk, or whatever liquid of your choice, and most importantly, helps me take my mind off of those thoughts that used to keep me wide awake. So if you're ready to turn down the stress and focus on the rest, head to my link in the description or scan the QR code to get a free frother with your first purchase of AGZ. And then once the storm passed, per se, it seems like Lystrosaurus had won by default. As in this new early Triassic world, this genus found themselves virtually alone, with basically no competition from other herbivores and little threats from predators, allowing them to rapidly expand and colonize Pangaea, especially in the south, where they were the most common land vertebrates by a mile, and could actually compose 95% of all life in certain environments. And so, it kind of goes without saying that this is crazy. And as far as Paleozoics go, you couldn't have done better than betting on the Lystrosaurus, as near no animal has ever dominated Earth to such degree by a percentage. And for comparison, we humans only come close to this number if we team up with all the animals we've domesticated. So simply put, time travelers should expect Lystrosaurus to be on the sightseeing list not once, but a few times. But in the end, other life also called this new world home, even if only shortly, as interestingly enough, some of the immediate survivors wouldn't last too long, despite them, just surviving the worst extinction event of all time. And this also included the animal you'd hope to avoid the most during this period, the Mosaurinus. This was a therocephalid that belonged to the Chironathidae family, and was in some ways the lion of the early Triassic. And honestly, it looked a tad bit like one too. Yet, this was no feline, nor even a mammal. But ironically, like lions, it did live within Africa, at least where Africa was back then, being primarily found in what is now present-day South Africa. And before the extinction has started, these guys appeared to have been on the rise, quickly replacing the various gorgonopsids as the top apex predators during the late Permian. But before they could achieve total domination, the rug was pulled from underneath them in the Great Dying, and they were left barely holding on. Yet, despite their weakened state, the Mosaurinus was still not to be trifled with, as they remained deadly as deadly can be, with their main tool of destruction being ultra-powerful, broad reinforced skulls and jaws, which housed curved and smooth cutting incisors, post-canines, and then most importantly, there are supersized canines that took on a saber-like appearance. And these unique teeth were comparable in length to the saber teeth seen in the gorgonopsids, the previous rulers, and are both thick and strong, allowing Mosaurinus to pierce through tough skin and retain iron-like grips on struggling prey, while simultaneously crushing down with its jaw muscles. However, despite the appearance of its canines, classically Mosaurinus isn't considered a true saber-toothed predator. And if you want to know why, go ahead and check out my last video, where I explain this and pretty much everything else about saber-toothed animals. So yes, it was not a true saber-tooth, but it definitely checked the apex predator box, and likely was one of the only things they could take down an adult Lystrosaurus, with the only real silver lining here being that these early Triassic Mosaurinus suffered from somewhat stunted growth, typically being 13% smaller than pre-extinction specimens. Almost like insular dwarfism, except on a global scale, which makes sense due to the Earth having lost so many resources. And we do see that many of the other predatory life tended to be smaller as well, nicely demonstrated by our ancestors, the Cynodonts, who also did produce a few herbivores and omnivores. Now, they had first emerged in the Permian, but were now, like the Lystrosaurus, solely reaping the benefits of being the last standing, and at the time were dominated by members of the subdivision Cynognathia, or the dog jaws, which could be found nearly every corner of Pangaea, and showed impressive levels of diversity, with each inhabiting a mixed environments and specializing in different niches. But what truly set them apart from other animals was their universally highly differentiated teeth, which allowed them to process foods with ease and efficiency. This also allowed them to compete a lot of other groups, in spite of not being super huge, with most being no longer than a few rulers in length. And even the largest genus from the Induan, the Echinodon, could be at most the size of a medium-sized dog. But something tells me it probably would have been a tad bit more rowdy. Alas, though, it wasn't our ancient ancestors, or even the Mosaurinus, who were the top predators of this wasteland Earth, at least from a numbers perspective. Is that title once a group that were not synapsids, and had been waiting for their shot? The Proterosuchidae, i.e. reptiles. This was a family of basal archosaurus, who literally only appeared right before the start of the Great Dying. And usually this would be considered the worst luck of the draw possible. But in their case, it was like hitting the jackpot, as they managed not only somehow weather the storm, but then, in the wake of the devastation, explode in numbers. allowing them to outpace the theropods who'd fared worse and occupy a wide range of niches. To us, or a time traveler, they'd probably be confused for some sort of proto-croc, as they were generally slender, long-snouted animals that were superficially crocodilian-like, only lacking the armored scutes we see in true crocs, while at the same time, their skeletons were much more primitive. Another defining trait that also made them easily recognizable was their large hooked faces that were filled with recurved, labiolingually compressed teeth that bore serrations, allowing them to easily slice and dice flesh. Despite looking very interesting, I would advise extreme caution around these guys, as they could be quite a bit bigger than the cynodonts, with the smaller ones being comparable to large monitor lizards, while the largest genus, the Proterosuchus, measured over 4 meters or 13 feet in length, and weighed hundreds of kilos or pounds. And to give you an idea what that looks like, here is what a 13-foot gator looks like. So yeah, good luck fighting that. There is one issue about this family though, and that is we aren't exactly sure what you need to avoid to prevent meeting one. Because while they typically lived around river environments, there is debate on whether they were terrestrial hunters, semi-aquatic hunters, or a bit of both, with there being evidence of different species occupying different niches. However, what we do know is that they were just about everywhere, with fossils being found in India, South Africa, Argentina, and huge parts of Russia. Now, this might not sound so widespread, but keep in mind, many places were simply inaccessible due to climate. So in the places where you could actually live, expect these guys everywhere. And so with all these groups mentioned, you now have a pretty good idea of what life was like on land following the apocalypse, with the rest of the animals predominantly being made up of scattered insects, small parareptiles, and arthropods. So not exactly a whole lot going on, and this might give you some false confidence that other areas of Earth, like fresh water, were lacking too, and thus safe. Yet, this would be a fatal miscalculation, as much of the rivers, lakes, and swamps of the early Triassic were anoxic. In other words, lacking dissolved oxygen, which created dead zones for most aerobic lives. Now, this is a small joke because of course we don't breathe water anyways, but still tread carefully in these parts, as there was one kind of animal that was going on a bit of a rampage in fresh water, amphibians, which almost makes you nostalgic for the Carboniferous, am I right? And funnily enough, a lot like the Carboniferous, it was a very specific group that was doing well, the Temnospondyls, an ancient order of primitive tetrapod amphibians. Now, these guys can be summed up as having been like the Predatophagus, a bit croc-like superficially, and were generally much larger than the amphibians of today. And just like the Proterosuchids, they were pretty much everywhere, and you'd be hard-pressed to wade in the waters and not feel one of these guys latch onto you, considering that the vast majority, if not all, were eager carnivores that could also provide you with endless horrifying experience, as there was a lot of diversity across their teeth and jaws. Some had narrow and slender skulls and conical teeth, signify expertise in catching prey, while others bore robust and widened skulls that were fitted with teeth better at cutting or crushing. You would have also had the quote-unquote joy of experiencing their various sizes, as some were no bigger than your hand, while others were routinely longer than you. And these early Triassic Temnospondyls held a global distribution, but did really like to flock to concentrated areas, in making up an uncomfortable amount of the total life. And this overpopulation of amphibians typically occurred in areas of freshwater rivers and lakes were abundant. And funny enough, one place that really took a liking to them is the usual suspect when it comes to strange wildlife and creepy crawlies. In other words, good old Australia, as it was there where the Arcadia environment was found, an early Triassic formation in which 90% of every single animal was an amphibian, with the remaining 10% being fish, reptiles, and synapsids. And it wasn't just freshwater where you could expect these amphibians to be lurking, as opposed to now, where there is just one amphibian who can endure the sting of salt water. Back then, many could. And some of the Temnospondyls were actually marine, which is a great segment into what the oceans and seas were doing following the Great Dying. And honestly, it would really be more accurate to me just to say the oceans. These big old bodies of waters were the main trend, with just two bodies being the main players. The superocean Panthalassa, which dwarfed even our current Pacific Ocean, and then the Paleotethys, which lay to the east, sitting within the islands of China. Just like the land and the freshwater environments, the oceans too have been dealt a number, and were still quite inhospitable in certain ways. Like I mentioned previously, the average sea surface temperature was much higher, for one. It would have essentially felt like a warm bath, while large swathes around oxic, just like in the freshwater environment, intended to run low on the pH side, in other words, acidic. In taking a dive in most places would have made you think you were swimming on some sort of alien planet, as not even the reefs felt or looked the same, would the vast majority be microbial reefs, the set of coral reefs like now. The water might have appeared different too, not being the blue like we are used to, as some studies revealed high presences of green and purple sulfur bacteria, whose pigments imply that sections of the ocean were a range of murky green and olive colors, as well as some purplish brown hues, especially near shore and in epicontinental areas. So between this overgrowth of bacteria and all the different water conditions, it's no surprise the marine life could be pretty barren. And given that you were on the Pantalasic superocean, this pretty much meant you could swim in the water for a near endless amount of time without really having to worry about some jaws interrupting the vibes. Yet, in the end, life of course persisted beneath the waves, at least in some parts, with the highest concentrations being seen in coastal or shallower waters, especially in those of the Pilotathys, which were somewhat protected and boxed in. And if you were going to take a cruise here, I'd highly recommend bringing along a fishing rod or two, as the kings now, or fish. And I'm not talking about sharks, but rather raven fish and the coelacanths, who have been larvae unaffected by the volcanic eruptions. Many kinds are represented in these waters, such as Australosomus, Bobacitrania, Pteroniscolus, Sorichthes, and Wettia. And when looking at them, we notice that a common trope of these fish was that they pretty much all held cosmopolitan ranges and were the top predators, representing just about the only time that bony fish were at the tip-top of the food chain, with the largest marine predator likely being one of them, the Berggeria. This was a worldwide found, bull shark-sized fish that was a evidently voracious hunter, using extraordinary speeds and unique conical teeth to feast on a wide variety of animals, which we know, based off of fossilized stomach remains, at the very least included other fish. Go figure. The location and frequency of its remains also showed that this predator often lived offshore, so good news for anyone looking to enjoy some early Triassic beaches. Although, of course, I do still to recommend caution, as while rare, other apex predators did prowl the coasts, and this included the well-known Hypodontids, a group of ancient sharks that had been around since the late Devonian, and managed to slip by the Permian extinction. Now, many of the time were smaller sharks, with the Lycidas, for example, being just a tad bit bigger than your foot, while another known genus, the Pileobates, was just about an arm's length. And so, unsurprisingly, these smaller kinds of Hypodonts likely wouldn't have paid much heed to human-sized food, nor human-textured food for that matter, as they typically had adaptations for crushing hard-shelled prey or catching small fish. But there was one kind that could at least still give you a hell of a fright and probably a painful bite, the Acridus. This was a Durophacus genus, possessing blunt and broad teeth, but was quite large for an early Triassic Hybodont, achieving a length similar to the Berggeria, with the largest specimens measuring about 2.5 meters or 8.2 feet. Oh, and along with its swimming in the oceans, it seems that it too could also travel into fresh waters if it pleased, with the only saving grace here being its limited range, as it was restricted to the waters just around the US. And swimming side by side with the Hypodonts was another group, the Elasmobranchi, which you may know include modern sharks. However, when it comes to this group, we pretty much know next to nothing, as only fragmented teeth have been found in Triassic formations. So in other words, we know they were there, but bony size and knees are out of the picture. And so this does obviously open up a lot of mystery around them. But the true mystery of the Indian waters don't concern them, but rather a legendary family of fish from the Permian, the Eugeniodontidae. They are a poorly understood order of extinct fish, yet were clearly one of a kind, possessing some of the most iconic jaws of all time, showcased by the likes of the giant Heliocoprion or Destis, whose faces are both hard to look at and to turn away from. And for a long time, it was believed that these guys had perished in the Great Dying, along with 90% of all other animals. However, at some point it came to light that they might have survived far longer than we thought, and were actually present in the Induan. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately depending on how you look at it, it wasn't these two genera that had survived. Rather, the Fidenia, a much smaller type who measured about 1.5 meters or 5 feet in length, but still had that remarkably strange face, which in its case consisted of a speared rostrum on top and a wheeled jaw on the bottom that held teeth designed for shelled prey. Additionally, other finds showed the closely related Carciotis persisted in these waters as well, a shark of near exact proportions at diet, although it did lack an elongated upper nose and generally kept up with the whole wheeled face look. What's pretty cool about these two is that they actually seem to go hand in hand, as the waters off of Pangaea in Canada are routinely home to both. And not just them, but also to a third kind as well, the Paradestis. And this is rather big news, as it wasn't a part of the same subdivision as the former two, instead being a type of Edistoideo, which are also known as the fizzer-faced sharks for their iconic vertically split mouth. And in it, the Paradestis contained an interesting blend of both pavement-like teeth and those that could cut you, especially in the bottom of its tooth whorl. And because of the strange blend, we don't know exactly what it ate. But whatever it did, it seemingly helped to survive the extinction event. And there is further evidence of yet more of these sharks around Pangaea, so it seems like they remain surprisingly diverse. But, as the story somehow goes, it would not last too long, as by the Triassic, they were all gone. But though these guys and many of the other strange and fascinating life disappeared, even after for surviving the worst extinction event of all time, life would then go on to create the next iteration of oddities, as the following millions of years would produce legitimately some of the strangest animals of all time. But that's a story for a different time. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct Zoo.